What's up, everybody? It's your boy Ryan, and this is the Thunder Channel on nootropics. Thanks so much for being with me. So we're going to talk about how to use nootropics in targeted ways. Now I'm going to give you a lot of high-level stuff, so really like 50,000-foot view perspectives on this, and then we'll get into some details as we talk about the sort of hierarchical categories in which you would need brain performance for certain stuff that you're doing. Look, there are 1,001 ways to use nootropics, and in this video I'm going to break down identifying first, like, well, what do I need? What am I lacking, right? How can I optimize brain performance in a way that is relevant to what I am ultimately trying to do? Because if you're not using nootropics just to induce random states for no reason, like you're using them in a targeted way to induce very particular states for a very specific reason, usually work output. In the meantime, we've got some epic nootropic products at livecortex.com. They support this broadcast. Don't fast forward the video. Go to livecortex.com and get Cortex. Look, if you want a powerful verbal fluency, mental energy, motivation, nootropic stack, it's just a very simple take 2 capsules and you're in. It should have been called gear because it just gets you into gear. It has a lot of other perks too, like verbal fluency. Get the Cortex nootropic stack. Extremely powerful stimulant energy that is clean and streamlined. Buy that at livecortex.com. If you are thinking like, hey, I might actually get that, stop the video, go to livecortex.com, add it to your cart, and check out now, then come back to the video. If you're wanting to learn more about nootropics, specifically in video courses that give you really, really high-powered stacks that are targeted for certain things, but also layer in principles on how to adequately use nootropics to get the best results, there are 3 echelons, if you will. Number 1, if you're brand new, Nootropics Ground Zero. Okay, so if you're brand new to nootropics, stop right now, go to livecortex.com, add that course to your cart, check out, watch the course. Number 2, if you're in a couple years but want to ascend at the 6-year mark where you get better results, you know more, you learn more, you have better stacks, you have better formulation and adjustment capacity, get the Nootropics Masterclass, another video course. The highest level of courses that we have and that really exists on the planet is the Nootropics God course. That is an hour and a half of action-packed, stack-ridden, strategy-ridden, ERS type of strategy on using nootropics. Get the Nootropics God course at livecortex.com. Lastly, if you want to skip the courses and have me formulate everything, I'll formulate your daily regimen, your sleep regimen, your test regimen, but importantly, your nootropic regimen, stacks that are targeted to your brain, an effective rotation schedule, labeling which stacks are effective for which tasks. If you want me, a 15-year neuroscience specialist, and really the world's foremost neurohacking expert, to formulate your entire regimen, work with me. We've either got a 3.5-month option, a 6-month option, or an annual option. These are hands-on, results-driven, one-on-one consults. Do those at livecortex.com. Okay. So look, there are 1,001 ways to be using nootropics, and we're going to talk about really all of them. I want to break down the categories of using nootropics, like, what do you need to do, and what brain states do you need to induce? And then specifically how to approach that from a 50,000-foot view perspective. So you need to work on the D2 receptor. And then from a granular perspective, like you would want to take inositol for 3 weeks, at 500 milligrams a day, taking weekends off to achieve a degree of upregulation of the D2 receptor. So I'm going to break all of this down so you guys have an idea. But before I do, look, the only way to use nootropics is using them in a targeted fashion, okay? You don't want to be one of those people that's chasing states. You just want to induce some sort of oddly stimulatory place because that makes you feel good. I mean, totally fine. But ultimately, if you're not capitalizing on better brain performance with better output and productivity, you're missing out. So that's really the point of this video. So to understand how to use nootropics in a targeted way, you've got to understand the basic categories in which nootropics are effective. All right, so I'm just going to give you a couple categories and then we'll sort of get down into the granular 5,000-foot view stuff. Number 1, I have energy, but I'm lacking motivation. Okay, I have energy, but I'm lacking motivation. Number 2, I've got motivation, but I'm lacking energy. I feel like I want to do stuff and I have the motivation to do it. I just really don't have the cognitive endurance or the energy. Number three, your baseline is okay, meaning the energy and motivation is there, but you just want to optimize on top of that for a 2 to 4 hour work stint. That would be like number three category. Number four, you need to enhance cognitive endurance and motivation, but for long periods of time, to do stuff maybe you're putting off, or there's just like something that you're working on, I don't know, you're an entrepreneur and you're building a new product, or you're a corporate person and you're working on a large presentation, something that's going to take you a long time to do, right? That's kind of the number four category. You need cognitive endurance for that, and you need motivation, but for long periods of time. Number five, do you need verbal fluency? Salespeople, I work with a lot of salespeople and people that are doing meetings kind of throughout the day, and they need their verbal fluency to be on point. That's a category that you've got to think about. Like, there are specific nootropics to be using in a targeted way to trigger verbal fluency. Number six, are you trying to repair something? This gets a lot more complicated, and a good bit of my specialty is taking people from suboptimal baseline states to highly performing brain energy and brain performance states through first repairing things, dopamine receptors, cholinergic receptors, energy baseline, hormonal function, and then working on top of that for nootropics. Okay, so that's another category. Are you trying to repair something? And that's kind of the last category that we'll couch it as. So that's the 50,000 foot view. You've got to identify first what exactly it is you're doing. Is it instantaneous and you're seeking an improvement in brain performance right now to be doing specific types of work? If so, what type of work do you need to do? What needs to be optimized? You need to focus better, verbal fluency, memory. Is it energy? Is it all of those things? And then, is it something more longer term? Like, you've got to repair some element of your baseline brain chemistry that is not functioning optimally. Okay, so that's the 50,000 foot view. Let's get into the 5,000 foot view on all of those individual things and how to actually use nootropics in a targeted way to fix those problems and to optimize performance around what you're wanting to do. So let's start with, I've got energy, but I'm lacking motivation. Okay, I have energy, but I'm lacking motivation. There are two primary ways, just for the sake of simplicity, to solve this problem. Number one, dopamine throughput. Increasing dopamine throughput, which basically can be defined as increasing the release and the transmission of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And there are targeted ways you can do that. Number two, heighten your stimulation with just dopamine release compounds, right? These are two ways you can solve the I have energy but I'm lacking motivation problem. Increase dopamine throughput, or heighten your stimulation with energy compounds that also foster dopamine release. So number one, right, increasing dopamine throughput. There are a lot of ways to do this. Off the bat, there's 9-methylbicarboline, okay? 9-MEBC does a lot of really interesting things biochemically and neurophysiologically. One of them is the restoration of dopaminergic cell bodies, a regeneration of dopaminergic neurons. Okay, that's really important. A lot of people think that 9-MEBC is specific to the receptor side of things. It's actually more targeted toward, through increasing the expression of critical dopamine synthesis enzymes like tyrosine hydroxylase, fostering the regeneration of dopaminergic neurons and general signaling. Fosters neurite outgrowth. It even reduces the expression of inflammatory cytokines, which actually can cross the blood-brain barrier and mess with brain function. But importantly, it's increasing the number of differentiated dopaminergic neurons. That's pretty critical, right? So if you're wanting to work on dopamine throughput, you're going to want to increase the quantity of dopaminergic neurons. And 9-methylbicarboline in a 25 to 50 milligram dose, 5 days a week, cycling off on the weekends, is a great singular strategy to work toward that outcome. Number two, heightening your stimulation with dopamine release compounds, okay? So again, back to this place of I've got energy, but I'm lacking motivation. You can target that by heightening stimulation with compounds that stimulate you, but that also force dopamine release. Those compounds would be things like caffeine, will force some dopamine release. Teacrine will force some dopamine release. Dynamine will force some dopamine release. Mucuna will get you to release more dopamine, but ultimately what it's doing is restoring levels of dopamine in certain regions of your brain. Striatal dopamine is just one example. And again, if you want to get nuanced about, well, which areas of my brain do I need to release dopamine, you've got to do the research and figure that out. And that really depends on what your issues are, okay? So again, you're increasing dopamine throughput. You can do that with 9-MeBC as one compound. You can also do that with bromantane as another. And you want to heighten your stimulation with dopamine release compounds. You can do that with teacrine, dynamine, even theobromine, and you can certainly do that with caffeine, okay? So that's the I have energy, but I'm lacking motivation. You got to work on dopaminergic signaling in the short term, and you can do that with some of the compounds that I discussed. Number 2, I've got motivation, but I'm lacking energy. I've got motivation, but I'm lacking energy. This is actually a really weird state to be in, where you're like, I actually feel like I am interested in doing this or that, but my energy levels are entirely too low. My cognitive endurance is not there for me to do it. Like, everybody has dreams. Everybody has things they want to do, right? But if you're not connecting that and bridging the gap between your dreams and, you taking action, which in the middle is, the energy to do it, you're not going to execute. So this is a little more of a complicated one. So you're motivated but lacking energy, because it requires you get a little more deeper into figuring out, well, what is the basis of the issue? Getting to the bottom of your energy problem is the core foundation, right? That you've got to start from. Like, let's just look at your breakfast. Was your breakfast riddled with sugar? Like, you had like pancakes and a ton of syrup or something on your pancakes. Like, that could be your issue. I mean, your options there are to wait it out for blood glucose to balance, because it's shot up too high and then it's dropped down too low and it's fluctuating. So your energy is not going to be streamlined. Or as a specific 5,000 foot view strategy, you could look into taking something like berberine, which is a glucose disposal agent. So in other words, clearing circulating glucose, because that's going to contribute high levels of circulating glucose to negative brain function. And there are other GDAs, glucose disposal agents, so that would be a route to look down. If your energy baseline issue, even though you have motivation, is related to blood glucose, and particularly maybe your breakfast or your previous meal. Plenty of people will hit me up and be like, hey Ryan, I feel good in the morning, and then somewhere around 2, my energy dips, and then I have some energy from like 3 to 6. I'm like, wait a minute, your energy dipped at 2. What happened around that time? Was it normal? Was it just some sort of innate thing that is your fluctuating energy, or did you do something? Like, oh yeah, I had a Kind bar, or some sort of energy protein bar, and it turns out that thing's got however much sucralose or sucrose or cane sugar in it, and that fucked with their glucose signaling and energy distribution, and now they've got bad energy. You've got to look into that. If it's your diet, look into it. If it's otherwise your diet that is making you not have good energy, you've got to understand why. Everyone's response to what their diet is these days is, I eat clean. I eat clean. And I want to be the first to tell you folks that there's no such thing as eating clean. There's no such thing, right? You're fooling yourself when you think you're eating clean because you think your diet is a clean diet. There are a couple ways to eat. There is eating for energy, eating reparatively, and eating for cellular stability, okay? Eating for energy, eating reparatively, and eating for cellular stability, right? Like if you're eating for energy, you'd be focusing on fiber-ridden good carbohydrates that allow you to sustain a certain degree of glucose release for a sustained period of time. If you're working on eating reparatively, you'd want to be consuming, well, a lot of fruits and vegetables, right? Because phytochemicals specifically are incredibly reparative. The antioxidants in fruits and vegetables are incredibly reparative to issues that you may have with cellular stability that is preventing you ultimately from having energy. If you're lacking one macro or the other, particularly carbohydrates, like that's a problem. That disrupts in this whole like keto adaptation phase, you're disrupting your energy signaling process for an eventual place where you actually have downregulated energy metabolism. Relying on amino acids and fatty acids is not optimal, despite what everyone may say and all the cherry-picked research and et cetera that's out there. I can tell you, unless you're trying to solve some major issue, like a disease state, that you may respond certainly better to keto or carnivore, etc. But eventually, especially for normal folks, the wheels are going to fall off the bus, particularly around energy distribution, energy usage, and hormonal function. We don't even go into gut function because the precursors for some of the really, really important species of bacteria in your microbiome are carbohydrates. Okay. So you've got to realize that if your energy issue is related to your diet, there are things you have to change. If it's glucose, first of all, you got to change what you're eating. But if you can't do that right now, or you're in an acute phase where you need to perform better and clear glucose, maybe take some berberine because it's a glucose disposal agent. And then also look at other GDAs, glucose disposal agents, to help that particular situation. But eventually get working on changing your diet. Everybody thinks they eat clean. There's no such thing, okay? You're either eating for energy, or you're eating reparatively to repair things, or you're eating for cellular stability. And ultimately, you should be doing all three of those things. Don't skimp on any macros. Make sure all that is balanced. And then also, just as an aside, make sure that you fully understand the nutrient density of everything you're eating. And understand what the RDAs are for vitamins and minerals, and then try to way surpass that with food, not necessarily with supplements. You can supplement that with supplements, that's what they're for, ultimately, but you want to be getting your nutrients from food as much as possible. So, back to the I have motivation, but I'm lacking energy. Well, you could just band-aid it with nootropics. A lot of you are like, I was just waiting for this part. Okay, certainly, fine. You can band-aid it with nootropics. And your candidates in this situation where you've got energy but or you've got motivation but you're lacking the energy would be modafinil. Okay, great candidate for that. 75 to 250 milligrams, standalone. Great strategy for resolving that situation in the short term. Teacrine, very powerful stimulating agent. In this particular case, you've got the motivation but are lacking energy. You'd want a high dose teacrine. You're talking about 200 to 250 milligrams. Dynamine, same thing, similar mechanism of action, should give you energy. You'd want to high dose it. 175 to 250 milligrams is really where you'd want to be at. L-tyrosine, another great chemical that will surge dopamine, noradrenaline, and adrenaline, so the catecholamines, and put you in a place where alertness and energy is a lot easier. You'd be looking at 100 to 1,000 milligrams. Again, dial that in. NALT, the acetylated version of tyrosine. You can get that in nasal sprays or take it in powder. 100 to 500 milligrams, let's call it. Chemicals like acetyl L-carnitine, which optimize brain cell mitochondria usage of fatty acids and help you to just generally have more energy. You could focus on the uridine CDP choline nootropic combination. There's a lot of literature on that. There's a lot of videos that I put out on that. And the Cortex nootropic stack encompasses that combination, right? Uridine and CDP, let's call it 150 of uridine, 85 of CDP choline, right? Change your doses if you need to, but that template is a great template to start so that you can band-aid energy with nootropics. And you'll probably end up getting motivation too on top of your already existing motivation. But the Cortex stack is really sort of a synthesized version of that. Like if you want the uridine CDP choline energy, you need to buy a bottle of the Cortex nootropic stack and you need to have it on deck. In fact, you should subscribe to it. Have it shipped to you every 30 days so that you always have those sets of chemicals on deck to use for increasing your energy with nootropics. Okay, so that is, you've got the energy, or you've got the motivation rather, but you're lacking energy. Like now you have the energy on top of your motivation because you use nootropics in a very targeted way, and hopefully you change some diet-related things to get things done. But the energy process, again, is really the underlying thing to look at here. Like, go back to like what may be sapping you of energy. You're this baseline creature. And if you don't have energy, there's something causing it. There's either something missing or you're doing something that is preventing you from having streamlined energy. Folks got to realize this. There's something causing it, physiological thing causing it, and that can be many things. Or you're doing something that is preventing you from having energy. Overtraining would be one of those things, you know? Like let go of your testosterone for just a little bit. I have been down that route and played that game of being the guy that wants to overtrain because I'm ego pushing in the gym. Stupid, because ultimately it sapped my energy. There's no amount of calories and carbs, and even resting after that really ultimately made me feel normal. There's a certain level of minimum effective dose that's actually really effective. Not sleeping well. A lot of people, sort of just brush this under the rug as if it's really not significant, or I'll just band-aid it with nootropics. Look, brother, sister, you've got to focus on sleep. That's an entirely different video. It should be another 40-minute video if I could, of just straight focusing on what is affecting your sleep and how to improve it. Eating the wrong things, again, goes back to what we were saying, ongoing systemic inflammation. You know, if you've got motivation to do things but your energy is sapped, you may want to look at ongoing systemic inflammation. You know, these inflammatory cytokines that get released ultimately to help repair a cellular injury or insult can cross the blood-brain barrier and literally affect the synthesis of dopamine, serotonin, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and GABA, and probably glutamate. They literally inhibit the synthesis of major neurotransmitters if you've got systemic inflammation. So those are things to look at. All right, moving on to some acute situations in which using nootropics in a targeted way is smart, and I'm gonna break down how to do it. Your baseline is okay, but you wanna optimize it for 2 to 4 hours, okay? Your baseline is fine, so you've got motivation, you've got energy for the most part, but you're just like, I want to optimize on top of this. And by the way, this is the best way to be using nootropics, right? You don't want to be band-aiding a bigger energy or motivation issue. You want to get those things straight and then use nootropics on top of that. The most highest performing people I know, including myself, have great baseline energy, and then we're layering nootropics on top of that to basically turn us into beasts. All right. So in this particular situation, your baseline is fine, but you want to optimize it for 2 to 4 hours to do a work stint. So you have to ask yourself some questions at this point. Do I need enhanced memory only for data and processing work? Like, am I going to do my taxes? Am I going to sit down in QuickBooks? Am I going to sift through a spreadsheet and try to glean things from it? Whatever the hell you people that do data, am I going to be programming? And I've got the energy and motivation otherwise, but I just need to process better for 2 to 4 hours. In these situations, you'd want to look at racetams, Noopept, or PRL-853, and potentially a combination of all those things. Racetams, Noopept, and PRL-853. So let's break down a couple stacks for this particular situation. A good template for a racetam stack would be stacking multiple racetams together. Let's just call it 2. Modest choline source, modest dose of a stimulant, and then a balancer. Okay, so you'd want to situate a stack like this: 400 milligrams aniracetam, 400 milligrams oxiracetam, 50 milligrams citicoline or CDP choline, 50 milligrams teacrine, and then like 30 milligrams of L-theanine, right? Seems simple, dose a little low. It's actually a very powerful synergistic combination. I'll put the stack in this on the screen in front of you guys again so you can look at it. That would just be one option in the case of needing enhanced working memory to focus on data or processing work. And again, you've got to ask yourself that question before you even start to work. What is it that I need to do? You land on working memory, that's one stack for it. Let's discuss a Noopept-centered stack. A good Noopept-centered stack, let's just combine that with PRL-853 for the sake of time, because you can do this, but you've got to do it carefully, would be 5 milligrams of Noopept, 5 milligrams of PRL-853, and a B complex. Okay? 5 milligrams Noopept, which you can achieve by taking 10 milligrams, weighing it out on the scale, and just splitting it in half. Same thing with PRL-E53. Weigh out 10, which you can do on a scale, 5 is harder, and then split that powder in half, and then you basically got 5 milligrams. That combination alone should be very effective for enhancing processing. Now, you could add on top of that, if you need a little more stimulation, add some teocrine, add some dynamine, maybe add some alcar. Those will be powerful energy compounds. Maybe add some tyrosine, some NALT, again, all individually. These will add energy to your stack, but if your focus is primarily processing, that's what you would use. Next, do you have a lot of somewhat mindless stuff to do? Meaning like it doesn't actually require that you process better or you're processing fine, or like you're really good at it, so you don't need enhancements in processing, but you're just lacking the cognitive endurance, the endurance to sit through something for 3 to 4 or 5 hours. You have to identify that. You've got to ask that question, right? What am I about to go do? Is it mindless and I'm already good at it? And so there isn't a need for increased processing because I like doing it, I'm really into it. I just maybe need 3 to 6 hours, let's call it, of cognitive endurance. In that situation, you'd be looking at primarily modafinil. You'd be looking at compounds like alcar, right? Helps cognitive endurance over long periods of time. Teocrine, dynamine, and theobromine. Now, there is a way to stack them all together. Do that very judiciously with low doses, but ultimately you probably want to try them individually and see how your cognitive endurance fares. But those are sort of the compounds to use as even bases to then even build intelligence stacks on top of that. Like you could have 100 milligrams modafinil, 200 of alcar. You've got the energy pretty situated right there and the cognitive endurance. And then maybe just as a balancer, like 100 to 300 milligrams of lemon balm. It'll give you a little more usable GABA in the acute period where the stack is affecting you, lemon balm. Okay, so that's just one example of needing cognitive endurance for a long period of time where everything else is pretty much fine and the work that you're gonna do is relatively mindless. Like you don't need to think a lot. You just need to plug away or do whatever. Again, chemicals like tyrosine, NALT, phenylalanine, all in through different bioabsorption, but ultimately in the same end goal, the same neurophysiological effects, raising noradrenaline, dopamine, and adrenaline, effectively known as the catecholamines. The diet side, back to the diet side, make sure that prior to work, right, if you're going to be working for a long stint of time, your energy is pretty fine, your motivation is pretty fine. On the diet side, make sure you're eating a slow delivering glucose meal. Okay, like in the morning, so my primary work time, well, it's hard to say because I have a couple different slots for the day where my primary work times are. They are the morning, they are the afternoon time frame, and then they're night, evening, all the way through the evening is like, when I pretty much work all day. I love it. But the morning time frame, I eat oatmeal, okay? Not the instant oatmeal, like not crappy, super sugary oatmeal. Old-fashioned oats, you actually have to boil water and like put it on the oats and let it sit, and let it, let the water soak through them. Some bananas, some strawberries, some cinnamon, which also helps glucose signaling, and that's about it. But my oatmeal meal sustains my energy for like 5 hours. Like I eat it in the morning, and I'm usually up at 6, 7 in the morning every day. Usually like 6. I don't need to eat until like 2. I don't need to. I may feel a tad hungry on the 1 p.m. side or something, but I still work through it and whatever. I've got sustainable energy this entire time through just a slowly distributing glucose meal, like oatmeal. It's honestly very awesome. So you got to think about that, right? Focus on sustainable energy on your diet side if you need endurance. Use the nootropics too for this, as we just described. But ultimately, you should have, diet should be factored into that. Again, using these performance optimization strategies in a very, very targeted way. Do you need to enhance cognitive endurance and motivation? Just like we just talked about, and your baseline's kind of okay, but for really long periods of time. This is like the 8 to 10 hour stretch. And I've got clients that hit me up and like, today is one of those days where I'm gonna need to be on point for 8 hours. I'm gonna need to be on point from noon until just about 8 p.m. And I need incredible brain function throughout this entire time. What do I do, right? So I'll situate stacks for them in that situation. And we would be focusing specifically on long-lived nootropic stacks. Long-lived nootropic stacks. That's one option. And again, the longer-lived stuff would be modafinil, R-modafinil, hydrafinil, FL-modafinil, these analogs of the primary afinil, or phased dosing of Cortex. So if you need to work for 8 hours, a good strategy would be phased dosing of Cortex. So you take 2 capsules of Cortex right when you start. Again, hopefully you've had a good solid meal that's sustainable glucose over the course of the next at least 4 or 5 hours. And then at like hour 5, when hopefully you're taking a small little break, just kind of recuperating a little bit, and then you're gonna go hit the next 3 hours, just take 1 capsule of Cortex. That aligns with the strategy that we've talked about a lot, which is just a secondary dose of a nootropic that's the same later on in the day, should not be dosed at the same dose quantity as the previous dose. You really want to have it. And with Cortex, you can have it identically. Like you can half it and be very surgical with it. Like you're exactly halving it by just taking 1 capsule as opposed to 2. So those are good strategies, a modafinil strategy or just Cortex phased dosing throughout the day. You would want to be infusing in this particular case because, if you've got energy but you need to work for 8 hours, you definitely want to be focusing on usable dopamine. Because when the energy itself seems like it's running out, the dopamine will keep you firing. Okay? When the energy is running out, maybe you're hungry, the energy from the food that you ate is sort of kind of tipping off and it's not really, contributing much anymore, and you're starting to dip in energy, just infusing more usable dopamine will act as your energy in that period. The compounds you'd want to use to achieve that are, of course, modafinil, right? Mucuna is a great strategy to just give yourself usable dopamine. Okay, a mucuna supplement now makes a great mucuna supplement. You've got to experiment with the doses. I usually take 2 capsules of mucuna if I'm really needing a surge in dopamine in this particular situation. So it's got the right amount of L-DOPA infusing in there. It's not inhibited by the autoreceptors, and you actually get to use the dopamine. Or NAC. Or NAC, right? Combining these compounds would be useful as well in doses that are intelligent. NAC is just going to allow you to better synthesize the dopamine from raw precursor, okay? So, in the case where you need a long stint of energy, you want to be using compounds like modafinil or like Cortex in that phased approach. But even simultaneously, in either way, when your energy starts to run out later on the latter part of that engagement, you probably want to focus on infusing more dopamine. You could do that with another minor dose of modafinil, and then make sure you're taking glycine or something at night, or L-theanine to make sure it doesn't disrupt your sleep, or mucuna, or an acetylcysteine, okay? Lastly, second to last, we're going to talk about verbal fluency. Look, salespeople, you guys understand the need for this. People that are doing content, some of you that I'm working with actually do content as well. You're a YouTuber, you're putting out Facebook content, you're creating presentations. That's content in and of itself, right, in business. You're going to a lot of meetings and you need verbal fluency. Again, being targeted, you've got to identify, if I'm going to take a nootropic stack, well, what do I need to do? I need to be more verbally fluent in the next 4 hours. So let's focus on that. The verbal fluency compounds, the primary ones to keep it very simple that you want to be focusing on, is the uridine monophosphate CDP choline combination. Okay, so those two, again, the template being 150 of uridine, 85 of CDP choline, and then adjust up or down to see what ultimately fits your brain template, but that should be a good starter template for most folks. The Cortex stack, it's not what it was built for, but it's one of the major byproducts of using Cortex, verbal fluency. It's easier to take all that stuff that's in your head and just put it into words. It just comes out seamlessly. Little ands, little uhs and breaks and stuff. Your brain just works super fluidly, right? Because you're working on the fluidity elements of your brain, particularly inducing neurogenesis, dopamine, a little noradrenaline release, etc. So the Cortex stack would be a great option there. And then lastly, for verbal fluency, there is Noopept uridine CDP choline, okay? That's a separate strategy with 3 chemicals that stack together, and I'll give you a template, are very, very effective for verbal fluency. for most folks. The template would look like this: 7 milligrams Noopept, 150 milligrams uridine monophosphate, 85 milligrams CDP choline. So not all that different, we're just adding Noopept into the mix. 7 milligrams of Noopept, 150 of uridine, 85 milligrams CDP choline. Alternatively, for verbal fluency, this has been reported in a lot of my clients, myself, and random people that I've suggested this stack to. For verbal fluency, the AACT stack. The AACT stack. The AACT stack is Alcar, alpha GPC, caffeine, and theanine. It is one of the most synergistic, nootropic stacks there are. In fact, someone should make a stack from it. I'm going to make a stack from it, like a commercial stack. It's very, very powerful. And the template goes something like this: 300 milligrams of Alcar, 75 milligrams alpha GPC, 120 milligrams, 100 to 120, call it a cup of coffee of caffeine, and then you're really looking at 50 to 150 milligrams of L-theanine. Start at 100, see where you're at. That is a great template for the AACT stack, and that should induce verbal fluency. Lastly, repair, okay? Using nootropics in a targeted fashion. Maybe you don't need to, you've got strategies for inducing states on cue right now, or for a 2 to 4 hour work stint, or a long, I need 8 hours of cognitive endurance type of stint, or data processing, memory type of work. You've got stacked for that, but you've got an overarching, underlying, additional longer term problem that you've got to fix. You've got to repair something. Okay, this gets a little more complicated, and again, this is my specialty, taking people from suboptimal places in terms of brain performance. When there is an issue with a dopamine receptor site, or sites, or cholinergic receptors, etc., or the signaling of certain neurotransmitters, and then fixing that and bringing them back to a high performance state. So let's call it dopamine receptors. Let's call it dopamine receptors, okay? So you've burnt them out from whatever. Too much porn, too much masturbation with porn. That's just one example. Pharmaceutical stimulant use in the past, all these major hardcore dopamine agonists chemicals will certainly desensitize receptor sites, D2 specifically. So you've got to look at, this is the general framework, 50,000 foot view. You have to understand the science behind the dopamine agonists, if you will, that you've been taking that may have caused dopamine receptor burnout in relation to which receptors they downregulate. Which receptors do they downregulate? And typically that ends up being D2. Okay? The dopamine agonists typically end up desensitizing D2. So D2, dopamine receptor, needs to be upregulated. But in what way? This is where you have to get a lot more nuance in using nootropics targeted. There's the presynaptic and postsynaptic receptors. The presynaptic is really an autoreceptor, so it governs how much dopamine actually gets released to the postsynaptic receptor. The postsynaptic receptor you can really think of as the activation receptor, right? So when dopamine hits it, you get the dopamine response from the postsynaptic receptor. So which do you need to focus on now? It gets a lot more nuanced. A lot of you aren't going to go down that side, but you should if you want to understand it. For the D2 postsynaptic side, you'd want to look at targeted dosing with cyclical strategies of chemicals like cordyceps. Okay, cordyceps has a lot of good research on the targeted upregulation of postsynaptic D2 receptors. Inositol, the same, and acetyl L-carnitine. There's another chemical that has a sensitizing response on dopamine receptors. 9-methylbcarboline, or 9-MEBC, is another strategy, though more broad and not necessarily specific to a certain receptor. It's wise to do the research on 9-MEBC to actually understand, based on your issue, if 9-MEBC is right for you. I mean, you can take it as a stimulating compound. It'll certainly stimulate you, right? Because it's working on dopamine throughput, dopamine signaling. It's doing a lot of different things, not exclusively trying to upregulate the receptor side, but really restoration of dopaminergic neurons, right? And dopamine throughput, the actual signaling of dopamine. So 9-MEBC would be a great strategy if you've got to repair the dopamine signaling process. And again, cordyceps and inositol and Alcar. And longer term usage strategy, you're looking at 5 days a week, medium dosing them. giving it time, cycling off on the weekends, not doing it for 2 days. This is another mistake. I'm trying to pack as much useful information based on what I've seen in consulting. Don't do reparative strategies for 3 days and go, nothing's working, or even 5 days. You're not looking at 2 days, you're looking at 2 weeks. You're not looking at 5 days, you're looking at 5 weeks. You've got to do these things for long periods of time to really notice if they're working or not, because plenty of people will identify there's a problem with D2, dopamine receptor, start taking compounds to alleviate it or upregulate the receptor sites and function. But after 6 days or something, there's no discernible result or positive effects. They stop when really you should have been doing it for 6 weeks. Okay, so that's a thing to think about. Lastly, on the repair side, we'll touch on acetylcholine, a major neurotransmitter that sometimes does need repair on the receptor side for people, and the signaling side. You just need to work on better cholinergic signaling, right? So say you get enough choline in your diet from like eggs and beef liver and fish and things that have choline in them, right? Or you even take precursors, building blocks that are bioavailable, bioabsorbable, they end up in your brain, they synthesize into usable acetylcholine, they bind to receptors, give the effect. But you don't have a strong cholinergic response from it, right? You don't actually have increased memory, focus, processing, which is what cholinergic should ultimately do for you. Then you probably have either desensitization of the receptor sites or uptake problems. Desensitization of the receptor sites, meaning they're downregulated, or an uptake problem. So say you have an uptake problem. The single most effective chemical for fostering choline uptake is a racetam chemical called coliracetam. Its primary job is to foster the function of high affinity choline uptake. That is, you taking choline from the diet, synthesizing it into usable brain acetylcholine to then be used and bind to postsynaptic cholinergic receptors. Coliracetam, in this particular case, you'd want to be taking 20 to 40 milligrams 5 days a week, cycling off on the weekends, and again, you'd want to do that for at least a month, just to sort of see how it's affecting you, and then maybe bring back some cholinergics and see then if they're affecting you positively. Number 2 strategy, specifically on the receptor side, is temporary anticholinergics to give the receptors a break, but ultimately to force upregulation of the receptor sites. So temporary anticholinergics, and you have to be really careful with this, and you should do your research and figure out which compounds will antagonize, meaning basically bind to and block the action of cholinergic receptors. Because when you do that, you both give them a break, and in most cases that forces them to upregulate, even if it's temporary or at least in some fashion. You'd ultimately be looking at a cyclical strategy of using an antagonist, going off the antagonist, seeing how that, seeing how you fare, how that worked, going back on the antagonist for 3-4 days, go off for 3-4 days, see how that worked, and a cyclical strategy like that for like a month or two, if you really want to work on fully sensitizing cholinergic receptors. One such chemical is a compound called cyproheptadine. Okay? You got to be really careful with this stuff. Do not dose any more than 1 milligram of it. It comes in a dropper solution from a company called Ideal Labs. I think it's ideallabs.com. They've got cyproheptadine. It's ultimately an antihistaminergic chemical, but it's also anti-serotonergic, so it'll block some serotonin receptors for a brief period, and it'll block some cholinergic receptors also, leading you to a place where if you're using it cyclically and intelligently, we'll have some upregulation of the cholinergic receptors after that. If it's not the... Oh, and then nicotine. Okay, number 3 is nicotine. Okay, the research is very clear on this. Nicotine increases acetylcholine receptor density, and also people that consume somewhat large amounts of nicotine have more cholinergic receptors in general. Okay, so they actually have more binding sites for acetylcholine to go and provoke the cholinergic effect. All right, so summing this all up, or finishing up on this last thing, I mean, there's always curveballs when you're trying to use nootropics surgically to repair a particular situation. Like, I had a guy recently come to me with aphantasia. It's an inane sort of inborn problem with brain function where the person lacks the ability to see visual imagery in their head relating to situations. A lot of us, how we characterize and perceive the world when we're thinking about it, when we're not interacting with it, is through images in our brain. People with aphantasia can't actually make images in their brain, so it's a really bad situation, right? So I've had all kind of examples of people that have come in with all kinds of strange issues in terms of neurochemistry, like, you know, the guy's occipital lobe is not functioning correctly. I've had to really research things that target the issue, start experimenting, make notes on the feedback, and then repeat that strategy. Okay, so we'll get to that in just a second. That's sort of the template for that, but that's just one example. Another example, you believe there's an overpopulation of serotonin. And that can inhibit dopamine transmission, which is not good. You would want to work on the SERT. If you think there's an overpopulation of serotonin, you would want to work on the serotonin transport of the SERT. The best two ways I know of to work on the SERT, upregulating its function so that it can clear from the synaptic spaces serotonin, so it's not sitting around binding to receptors, desensitizing them, causing inhibition otherwise on dopamine, is phased usage, continuous usage of Bacopa monnieri. Okay, so Bacopa monnieri is a nootropic compound that upregulates the SERT in the clinical research. And secondarily, you would want to raise the hell out of your testosterone if you're a guy. If you can focus on raising testosterone concentrations pretty consistently, your total test, right, in a linear fashion upwards over a long period of time, you will upregulate the SERT and therefore get more control of serotonin. Okay, so that's just, you know, one specific, you know, example of a sideball miscellaneous thing that you may need to be working on. You may need to work on testosterone itself, right, just to feel better. And you can use some nootropics with that. In fact, there is research on mucuna through its dopaminergic action and through some other action. Mucuna is like it's a bean, and there's a lot of different chemicals in mucuna actually that contribute to the effects that it's giving you, has shown restorative effects in the clinical research on testosterone levels in men. So as I was saying before, though, the important thing is the template. And the template is identify potential issue in brain chemistry, research nootropics that target that issue, and then start experimenting. And then take notes. Don't just give it 2 days, give it 2 weeks. Don't just give it 5 days, give it 5 weeks. On your notes, how is this affecting the issue that I'm having, right? If it's affecting it positively but not that much, maybe there's something missing. I need to add something else that's targeting the same thing, or I need to up the dose. I need to keep doing it. These are all the questions that you need to ask yourself and put together a strategy moving forward. But the template, identifying the potential issue in chemistry, researching the nootropics that target that issue on the chemistry side, start experimenting, make notes, go from there. I hope this video has been helpful for you folks that are wanting to really get a perspective of like where you end up after you've been using nootropics for a very long time, like I have. I got out of the just sort of instantaneous, oddly stimulatory state induction, which was sort of in the beginning, into a place where I'm like, well, wow, these chemicals have all very specific mechanisms of action, and like based on what I need to do, focus-wise, memory-wise, motivation-wise, energy-wise, stimulation-wise, like what do I need to be taking to execute that, neurophysiological response to make my performance on this task markedly better. That's where you get to after you really get into nootropics, using them super, super surgically. And this is a lot of what we teach in Nootropics Ground Zero, Nootropics Masterclass, and at the highest levels, Nootropics God Course. I mean, we're teaching a lot of that stuff in the Nootropics God Course. So go get that livecortex.com if you've been thinking about it. But ultimately, you've got to approach all of these situations very, very surgically. And if you do, and you put the thinking into the formulation of your stacks, you will have a different brain. I promise you that. Thank you so much for being with me, everybody. Go support us, livecortex.com. Look, we want to educate you on nootropics. We want to give you powerful nootropic effects. We want to give you a powerful nootropic stack. Number one, the Cortex stack. I built that stack myself, okay? It is a very powerful, strong motivation, mental energy, verbal fluency nootropic stack. You should go buy it at livecortex.com. In fact, you should subscribe to it. Get it shipped every month. Because then you can use Cortex for long, ongoing stints. You can use it for motivation. You can use it in a phased approach throughout the day. 2 capsules in the morning, 1 capsule later on. For having long stints where you need cognitive endurance. You can use it for sales meetings, for verbal fluency. You can use it for general energy. It pretty much does all of that. Powerful all-in-one stack Cortex at livecortex.com. Again, our courses, Ground Zero, Masterclass, Nootropics God Course. Find those at livecortex.com. And then lastly, if you'd like me to synthesize your regimen to formulate and tailor very targeted daily regimens, energy regimens, testosterone regimens, sleep regimens, but importantly, nootropic regimens that are highly, highly targeted, very diversified with a large quantity of nootropic stacks, this is what I do. Book a program with me. You've got a couple options, either a 3.5-month option, a 6-month option, or an annual option. And you can do these at livecortex.com. If you are in or know a business that is looking to optimize employee output, that is also something that I am specializing in that Cortex Labs does. Go to livecortex.com, click on the organizations tab, and send us your information about how many employees you have and what exactly you're looking to do, because we take an entirely different approach to brain performance, or to productivity rather, employee output, work output, and that is brain performance. When the brain is firing on all cylinders, so are your people. Thank you so much for being with me, everybody. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. Go hit that bell. Make sure the bell's hit. And if you just came here, subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for being with me. Share it on the web. Share it on Twitter. Share it on Facebook. Share it with your Facebook friends. Say, look, I am into this super sophisticated stuff called optimizing my physiology. This is where, modern kind of like interest is going. I've been in this industry and in this world for such a long time, and it's made me a different person. It has made me a highly productive, precision performance person. And you can be that way too. Thank you so much for being with me, everybody. Talk to you next time.